Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Digital History Seminar at the IHR. And I'm very pleased this evening to introduce Dr. Katrina Navickas from the University of Hertfordshire, who's going to be talking this evening on a project she worked on, Political Meetings Mapper, with the British Library Labs, mapping the origins of the British democratic movements with text mining, NLP, geoparsing, and crowdsourcing. The Political Meetings Mapper was one of the two winning entries for the British BL Labs 2015 competition, and her paper is going to discuss this tool and her experiences as she put herself down as a digital beginner. I'm sure that's no longer the case. Katrina is a senior lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. She's interested in popular politics in the late 18th and early 19th century, particularly spaces and places of protest. And she's the author of two monographs, Loyalism and Radicalism in Lancashire, 1798 to 1815, 2009, was it? And then more recently, hot off the presses, just this past year, 2015, Protest and the Politics of Space and Place, 1789 to 1848, from Manchester University Press. Before I pass over to Katrina, I'll just say that we are recording this. And we will record the question and answer just so everyone's aware of that. And hopefully everyone is happy with that. So it's there for posterity. And when it comes to the question and answer at the end, please speak up clearly and enunciate yourself so that everyone listening online can follow you. Right, Katrina, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. What I'd like to say, first of all, is that I was invited to give this paper at the start of my British Library project. So I gave the title without really knowing what I was going to do in the project. It was part of the exciting bit of it. So some of this paper is going to be about my experience doing a digital history project as a kind of beginner, I guess. So some of the things that I thought I'd be doing and that are in the title, I ended up not doing. So I'll be talking about why that happened and the processes. But I thought I'd start, first of all, by giving you a bit of the history, because I'm a historian and that's where I've come from. And I've been trained with pencil and paper in an archive, and I'm not trained as a digital humanist. So part of the project really was to see how far could I go learning digital methods, but I've come from a very traditional history background. So my interest is in political movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, and past couple of years I've mainly been working on Chartism. So for the uninitiated, Chartism was the biggest popular movement for democracy in 19th century British history. So they basically campaigned for the vote for all men. And what was helpful for me as a historian is that they produced reams and reams and reams of documents. So we actually do know quite a lot about them. But the history of Chartism is very traditional. It comes mainly from labour history and older forms of history that haven't been digitised, so to speak. I'm particularly interested in the geographies of protest. So I put on the screen Kennington Common photograph. That's one of the earliest lithographs or photographs that we have of the crowd scene in existence. And it's in Kennington Common in South London. And it's one of their big protest meetings in 1848. And my particular angle, my particular line on how I look at protest movements is I'm interested in where do they meet? Why do they meet in particular places? Do those places have long histories of protest meetings on them? So I've been working on that in an analogue method for all my career, but more recently I got into GIS and I'm quite interested in just mapping them digitally. So before I came to the British Library project, I've been working for a couple of years learning GIS, so I've mainly worked with QGIS. But again, it was basically drawing maps manually, essentially, but using digital tools to do so. So I'd be plotting the sites of where political meetings happen. So all those are on my website that goes on with the new book, which is protesthistory.org.uk. And I've kind of used a mixture of QGIS and Google Maps, Google Fusion tables, but all sorts of things that actually you can pick up quite easily as a beginner. You don't need to know how to code. Doing that, you just input a spreadsheet of data and it kind of plots it for you. So I'm still from a sort of historical geography perspective is where I started at the beginning of last year. But as I said, the Chartists are very textual in the fact that they left us, thankfully, a lot of records of where they held their meetings in the newspapers. So the main Chartist newspaper was called the Northern Star. It ran from 1838 onwards. And that's one of the main sources that we have for working out where Chartists held their meetings. And as I said, mainly I'd been doing it manually, so I'd been looking through the newspaper and then plotting them on a map one by one. So what I came to the British Library Labs project to do was see, could I make that process a bit more automatic and make it a bit more digital. So luckily for us as historians, the Chartist press is quite well organised and had different columns where they advertised what meetings they were going to hold that week, and also different columns for the previous meetings of the week, sort of reports back. So I decided to focus on trying to map all the columns where the forthcoming Chartist meetings were listed. And again, luckily for digital projects, they're in a fairly standard format. So they usually start with the place in capital letters, and then they give you the date and who's speaking. So it's fairly regular, and that helps because you're not trying to search through quite a thick block of prose to find out the information. You kind of already got it semi-sorted there already. So that was the kind of the aim of my project that I undertook. The problem, as I said, was that I've been trained analog, and I was trying to digitize myself. So this was the kind of the mock-up that I hoped to start with, and that's what I sent to the competition, that I wanted to go through these columns and plot them on a map automatically and geocode the locations automatically. So whereas I'd been doing that manually using Google Earth and so forth, I wanted to do that. So that was the process. Fairly simple, nothing particularly complicated about it. But what I would say is that I'm no Ian Gregory. I'm not at all versed in the finer points of digital history like corpus linguistics. So Ian Gregory, you may know, is at Lancaster, and he's got a whole team who've got a big funded project in spatial humanities, and they're very interested in how do you map text, and quite complex ways of mapping text, particularly to do with collocation. So can you map basically whole sentences? Can you map meanings of words and groups of words? So their projects particularly look at romantic writings of the late poets. So they're mapping the correspondence of late poets, also trying to map some of the poetry, and using quite abstract ways of looking at meanings. So they'll look at the co-location map that I've just picked out from their website, is trying to map where the word beautiful or words associated with beautiful are, and see if they correlate with what we'd regard as picturesque locations in the Lake District. I don't have the tools to do that, and he's got a whole team of researchers helping him and working with that. With the British Library Labs project, you're very limited in terms of time and resources and manpower. So it's basically back to a step which I found. This is a new slide that I added the other day because I went to see the Eames exhibition at the Barbican on Sunday, and quite a lot of that exhibition was about their collaboration with IBM in the 1960s and 1970s, and they did a whole project called the Information Machine. And I thought, I'm still at that stage that they were in the 1960s and 70s, where they were looking at different ways of information retrieval. Obviously, they were working from punch cards, and they had this wonderful system, and they showed some of the punch cards where members of the public would come in and ask for a particular date, and they'd go through the New York Times and put the punch card through, and the punch card would pick out an event that happened on that date from the New York Times. And I thought that's pretty similar to what I'm doing, but I'm using Python instead of punch cards. So I'm at kind of the Eames stage of information machine rather than the corpus linguistics NLP side, but I am getting there. But it's what I'd like to sort of emphasize today is about the fact that I think that people are a bit, I'll go back to the Ian Gregor process. I think people, when they think about digital humanities, think that it requires a big team, it requires lots of funding, it requires quite skilled and detailed knowledge of corpus linguistics if you're dealing with text. Actually, I think that there's nothing wrong with saying, let's start with some basics. And especially those who are trained in analog methods, actually it helps if you actually just start to think about the basics and think this shouldn't be scary, it shouldn't require a lot of money, it shouldn't require a big team. You can actually do quite useful things at quite a basic stage. And what I've found really is that academic colleagues and even academic students, those in the room accepted, are quite scared of the fact that digital history is something that seems to be complicated. And I think that's partly because the bigger projects do use bigger language and unfamiliar terms and bigger types of programs that you just don't get access to when you're an undergraduate or in sort of everyday life. So hopefully my project's trying to show there is a middle way between completely pencil and paper methods and the big team, huge digital humanities projects approaches, that you can do quite small things and that it isn't as scary as you might think. You just need to be familiar with some of the terms that are used and have a go. And I think that Adam's work, the programming historian, really helps sort of bridge some of that divide. Okay, so I'll just go through what the political meetings mapper did, what it aimed to do and what we ended up doing. It ran from the middle of May last year, and we did a showcase in November. So that's how long we had to do it. So the mission was to find out how many meetings we could extract from one newspaper, the Northern Star. We wanted to map where the meetings were held to see if there were any geographical patterns in that. And also another key aspect was to identify within the digital newspapers where the meetings data was automatically. So you didn't have to feed in the exact information, you could try and find out where it was within the document. And the newspapers are about 8 pages long. So each page is a separate image on the website. So which page is it on in terms of, can we identify what that type of column looks like digitally? So the sources are the digitized newspapers, and we're also using the georeferenced historic maps in the BL collection. So we immediately ran across some problems. And again, I think the plan looked really simple, but actually it came across lots of hiccups and trials on the way. But I think that was also part of the project in terms of learning what the difficulties were. I think that was a learning process in itself. So the first problem we had was actually finding the original files in the system. So people who work in the BL here know that it's a bit of a labyrinth of trying to find the original files. particularly as they were digitised, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. So when they were originally digitised, as far as I know, there wasn't really a sort of vision of what digitised newspapers would become as they are today. So how they would be best catalogued, where they would be put, and things get moved, like books on a shelf, they end up getting moved within the digital repositories. So actually finding the original files took about 3 weeks, with lots of help from the BL team. So just simple thing of actually finding the images and the XML to go with them and how they were all catalogued was quite a learning process. From someone who doesn't work in information sciences. So I don't really think like a librarian because I've not been trained like a librarian. I'm a historian who's normally an end user of librarianship. For me, it was also a learning process in terms of information science, trying to work out how do librarians catalogue things, particularly in that early stage of digitisation when they didn't realise potentially how big the whole system of digitisation would become. So once we found the original files, again, they didn't really match up with the XML files, and some of the image files were missing. So there's a whole section of 1842 newspapers we still can't find in the system. So, and because the XML was done, again, a decade ago, it's not very good. I've just put on the screen there sort of what it looks like, and it's okay, but it's mainly sort of just identifying the location of individual words on the page. So it's done by coordinates on the page, and there's lots of spelling mistakes and so forth. So as a usable type of file, that wasn't very usable for me at all. The other issue that I'll talk about later perhaps is the mapping, which was also a bit of a problem in terms of the software, which again I thought would be more simple than it was. So there was these sort of hurdles we had to face, but again it was a bit of a learning process. So how did we overcome them? One of the sorts of things that I thought we would have to do, and what's in the title of the paper today, was I thought we were going to have to crowdsource the transcription of the newspapers. And I know that that's what Bob Nicholson did in his BL Labs project last year that won in 2014, is that he got students to crowdsource the transcription and basically rewrite the text, because when he did the OCR of his newspapers and when he was looking for jokes within his Victorian newspapers, it was just impossible and he had to get them done manually. So we set up a whole platform using amica.net to do a sort of crowdsourcing interface where we would unleash these images onto the public or to willing students to transcribe them. And I thought that was going to take at least a month to do. So again, it would be quite time consuming and also reliant on a lot of volunteer labour who'd mainly be fed by chocolate. Yeah. But actually I thought, well, why don't we just see what the OCR's like, because I know that the columns were quite regular. So we ran it through the latest issue, if you like, of Abbey Fine Reader, which is the OCR scanning system, and I was really surprised about the success rate we got. We were looking at about 80% accuracy, which is astounding. Normally it's a lot less than that. So it was workable actually. So that's the screenshot of what it looked like. So we just fed in all the images and it seemed to spit them out quite accurately. So I only needed a couple of students who were looking for placement to go through and just double check. So we did go through and correct it. Mainly punctuation errors was what it was getting wrong, but the spelling seemed to be fine. So that didn't take as long as I thought it would. And it means that at least there's a process where I'm not reliant on a lot of volunteer labour to do it. I can just do it automatically. So we basically put through all the images through Abbey Fine Reader and they came out with text files of all the individual columns. So that was one of the first successes we had, that the OCR programs now are sufficiently good to do that. So if you want to do some OCR, I recommend you just at least try it. It helps that the Northern Star is quite cleanly printed. We're working from the original scans, not the microfilm, so it's fairly clean. And the text is fairly regular, and there aren't many illustrations or anything like that to confuse it, and not many tables as well. So all the usual things that confuse OCR programs didn't apply to this. So some of the other challenges we overcome, as I said, we didn't need to use the crowdsourcing platform because we'd already done the OCR recognition. The maps were a bit more of a problem. So we were looking at using historic maps, because I'm very interested in historic maps and showing places where these meetings were held. And we hoped to set up a platform where we could overlay lots of historic maps from the British Library collection. And we eventually did that, but we had to rely on our partner, very kind collaboration with the National Library of Scotland, who are a lot more advanced in their mapping facilities than the British Library are. So they handily have an API which is all open for anyone to use. So they have a layer of 1880, I think, OS maps. So part of the problem is that's a bit anachronistic for me as a historian, because it's about 40 years too late. So some of the places look a lot bigger than they actually were in the data that I'm using, but the timescale and the cost and the manpower that we had to rely on the API. But we did develop a mashup with one layer of the British Library georeferenced map of London using Leaflet, and the technicians at the BL, particularly Ben O'Steen, were able to manipulate the API so it could layer a map of London. So that's what it looks like on the website. So it's a bit small on the screen, but the bottom layer is the National Library of Scotland map, and then we've laid on the central bit of London, so the map of Oxford Street, which is a bit more contemporary to the data. There isn't enough server capacity, I've been told, to do our own layers. So I use a program called MapTiler to do my own layers, but it's proprietary software and it's quite expensive. So, and it uses a lot of server space. So if you wanted to do lots of layers, I think you'd need a huge lot of space to do that. So again, this was just a pilot, an experiment. I think future directions, I'd like to layer lots of maps on top of each other to show change over time and to show different areas. But at the moment, that's the limitation we had. And it was good that the National Library of Scotland have that API that you can borrow and mash up with your own data. Okay, so that's some of the problems that we overcame. So I'll just give you an overview of what the process is. So the process is basically you do the OCR first, then you geocode the data. So we sort of developed a code to extract the place names. Again, we've just been doing that in Adam's digital history workshop. That's quite easy to do with a bit of Python code. And then we built up a gazetteer to geocode the places, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the third stage was to date the meetings. So what I'm also interested in is developing a better tool to do that. So a lot of the meetings data says there'll be a meeting in the Hall of Science on Tuesday morning. Now, we don't know what that date is, but we do know the date of the newspaper. So basically we wrote some code with some regular expressions that said, okay, we know that the newspaper always comes out on Saturday. So where it says this Tuesday, we know it's going to be plus 3 days. So it was literally that you just built up a code that says, okay, where it says Tuesday, add 3 days to the date of the newspaper. And we also did some basic natural language processing for dates like tomorrow and yesterday, and fortnight and things like that. So it was basically layering up different possibilities of what the data might be. But as I said, because the newspaper data is quite formulaic, there weren't any real surprises, and the number of things we had to think of was quite limited because there's only 7 days in the week. And there's only certain date expressions that we needed to know. There's some funny ones, historical ones like Senite, and those sorts of things. But if you're a historian, you know that it means. Hang on, I've forgotten what it means.
A week.
It's in a week, yeah, because it's 7 nights, isn't it? So there's things like that, but there's only a limited number. So doing that, we were able to both find out where the places were and also what the dates of the meetings were, which for me is very handy because, again, I've been doing that manually and now I can do it automatically. So it's as simple as that, nothing more complicated, and there's no corpus linguistics really involved. But I think as a tool, that's quite handy for me as a historian. What I'm particularly interested in is, as a historian, of places that don't exist anymore. So my main interest isn't particularly in the text mining sort of side of things. What drives me as a historian, and increasingly as a digital historian, is the mapping side. So as I said, I've already sort of quite familiar with using GIS and QGIS and Google Earth and all the tools that are available, but this was the first time I tried to combine it with text mining and Python. So the middle step that we needed to do was to build a gazetteer. So first, when we extracted all the place names, we first ran them through just a standard gazetteer on the internet. So that one was from the UCLA one, Sandbox, which lets you export it in various different forms, which is why we used it. Some of them it misidentifies because Birmingham, it thinks is Birmingham, Alabama, because it's an American site. So we just had to write a bit of code to say, limit the parameters of the latitude and longitude. So if it's beyond this, then you're in the wrong place. And just check that for outliers. Sometimes it thinks things are in the middle of the ocean, kind of thing. But you can do that so that it just looks at UK latitude and longitude. What you also find in the historic data is that there's more than one variation of addresses. So the example I've put just a small snippet of that from the gazetteer was that One China Walk in Lambeth sometimes is also listed as just One China Walk. Sometimes it's just listed as Lambeth. So you just had to be aware that you had to list more than one address for that. John, who's in the room, has also kindly helped me with some of that, particularly on the London data, because he knows London better than I do. But we also have the problem of places that don't exist anymore, which the standard online gazetteer type services don't pick up. But that, for me, is the most interesting thing as a historian. That's why I'm interested in the history of maps, because you get to look at places that don't exist anymore on the map. So I just do them by eye, by layering georeference maps onto Google Earth, basically, and find the coordinates manually. Again, I'd be quite interested to look at ways in which that process could be automated. I'm not sure it can be very easily. But I'll just show you an example now. So that is South Manchester. And as you can see, there's not much there apart from the Mancunian Way, which is the big motorway and a lot of car parks. So that's what it looks like on Google Earth. The reason why it looks like that is there was a lot of slum clearance in the 1960s, and then they built the motorway through it. I love that picture because you can see the original Georgian Street plan after and the only buildings that are left after all the slums were cleared were pubs, which are, crucial. But what you do is you basically just layer the first edition OS town maps, and luckily, and I'm fascinated by these, I'm obsessed with these maps. The Ordnance Survey, in their wisdom, decided to do very small scale maps in the first edition of the main cities. So you can see there that where the Mancunian Way now is, it's quite densely packed terraced houses and lots of streets. And quite a lot of these places are places that I'm looking for. So I basically just layer the georeferenced town maps onto Google Earth and just have to pinpoint them manually if I'm looking by eye for places. And then you just get the coordinates off that. But even just looking at that contrast between then and now, I think is quite fascinating as a historian. So that's what we did. So we ran everything through the Gazetteer, and then ran everything through the Python code that dated everything. Not everything is accurate. There were some mistakes and some rough edges, but again, that was part of the process to see how it would work, but it did work. So we managed to get through 4 years of data, and we got over 5,000 meetings. And this is just from the columns that are the forthcoming meetings. So it's a fair amount. I mean, it's not big data, but it's for a historian who has previously been doing this manually, that's big enough for me. So that's what the CSV file comes out at. So you get the text of the meeting that's in the newspaper, get the latitude and longitude, the date of the newspaper, and also the date it's calculated that the meeting happened on. So it's still quite basic, but quite useful for me trying to work out when and where meetings happened. And it surprisingly also came up with 462 towns and villages. The reason why I've pointed that out is because the Northern Star wasn't the only newspaper, and it was printed in Leeds. So one would have expected that its meetings data would have been regional, but actually it seemed to have quite a large spread. It was the main Chartist newspaper, so it's got correspondents sending in their notices of what they wanted to advertise in it throughout. So again, I wouldn't have been able to do, well, it would have taken me a long while to do that by hand, but I think it shows you the sort of the national spread of the newspaper for the political movement. The other type of data that we found in those columns was the lecture tour data. So the Chartists didn't just hold meetings in their hometowns, they also had a system of paid lecture sort of tours, if you like, where they'd hire good orators to go around and do a tour of different towns to spread the word of democracy, if you like. So that data also showed that there were over 200 lecture tours advertised, and I'm slowly plotting all those. I'm not finished on the website plotting them all, but I think that will tell some really interesting patterns about where these lecturers went, whether they're successful in proselytising the word of Chartism and converting people to democracy or not. So slowly I'm building up on the website the tours of these different lecturers, and trying to, also we can do quite a lot in terms of distance there, which ones travel the furthest and that sort of thing. Some of them we know their names, some of them we don't. So there's an hater of oppression touring there. I don't know what his name was. Some of them are quite famous. So the famous leaders of the Chartist movement, like Bronte O'Brien and Fergus O'Connor, are up there. So for people who are interested in the big leaders, that's really important for them to see where they were going, but also sort of regional leaders and local leaders, because this was very much a grassroots movement that relied on local leaders and local branches to survive. So the website is on the Amica platform. It's all live. You can use it. It's called politicalmeetingsmapper.uk. And what we did was basically just have the map on the front page and just have small markers showing where the meetings are. It's not as user-friendly as I'd like it to be. And I'll talk about that in a minute in some of the drawbacks of using the platform. But Omica's designed for museum curation and digital exhibitions. So it is mainly designed for material objects, actually digitized photographs of museum exhibits. And it's not as well set up for this kind of stuff. So we did have to tinker a lot with some of the plugins. So we had to play around with the back end of getting this plugin to show the layered maps. Actually, you can't just say, please layer these maps. You actually have to mess with the code. And I can't do that. So Ben O'Steen did some of that for me in the British Library. But eventually we got it to display this. So it automatically plots the locations for you and shows you the text with the images of the newspapers. But again, if you go on the website, it's not brilliant in terms of user friendliness, and I'd appreciate any advice on what you think it could do to be more user friendly. So I'll just give you sort of a bit of an overview of the results before I finish with future directions. So one of the things that we did was organise a tour of London's Chartist venues. A couple of people in the room were at that, and we got thoroughly soaked on the day. But what was interesting was that there were so many London venues that will come up in this data. So we decided to focus on London. So we did a separate gazetteer for the individual places in London and came up with, I think, about 150 different venues in London, spread across London. So this is then laid on a Google map all over London, actually. Again, that was quite surprising for me. I thought that they'd be concentrated maybe in the working class areas, maybe in the East End, but they stretch all over. And all over what we now regard as Greater London. But then I also included Surrey and bits of Buckinghamshire and bits that you'd now regard as commuterville. So there's even Croydon in there for all the Croydon fans. The Sun in Croydon, which I've said to you before is now Morrison's local, but that's my patch. So zoom in again, sort of just looking at the range of places. Most of the places that we found are pubs, because those are the most accessible places that the Chartists, who were predominantly working class movement, would access, but they also built their own institutions, hired their own rooms. So the map there shows the London Social Institution, just off Euston Road, basically. Lots of different types of places, and then you can start doing fun things like mapping the concentration of the meetings. So again, I just ran the data through Google Fusion tables, and that gives you a kind of heat map of the places. So we found that Soho was the greatest concentration of places, but also Southwark, south of the river, also had quite a few places, and also in the East End, as you'd expect. Hopefully this data will sort of lead to more and more of these types of maps where we can see geographical patterns in where political meetings happened. And you can then do things, again, this is slightly anachronistic, but I plotted it on the Booth poverty map. Again, that comes again about 40 years later, so it's a bit anachronistic, but it gives you some sort of flavour of what you might be able to do with more social data. So if you plotted some more, if you had, say, the poor law data of places that were deprived, then you could perhaps compare the data with that. So basically, this is just showing meetings that happened in what area that is, kind of sort of East London. And the darker areas are where Booth classified as being poorer. Now, we've got to, again, quibble with his method of classification, but it's just a sort of flavour of the fact that some of these meeting places then go on to be quite deprived areas. And the red areas, if you're wondering, are slightly richer, or at least more commercial areas of London. Okay, so that's some of the results that I did, and I'm still messing around with mapping them all and refining the data. We also did an attempt at machine learning, which was completely new to me and quite scary as an academic historian. What we were trying to do was help the library classify their own results. So we're using IPython notebooks. It's quite a useful way of charting what we're doing in a more sort of prose form that I'm happier with. And we made a classifier that identifies meeting texts from other types of text. So we tried to classify what types of things came up regularly in the columns. So as I said, the meetings are normally advertised with the town names or the village names in capital letters at the start of the sentence. And then they generally are followed by some sort of date or day. So we ran that through a Python code which said, okay, well, that's the most common sort of characteristic of meetings data, and then we ran it through the Argos catalogue or something like that. I think it was it was some techie geek catalogue to say, can you find any of these meetings in the catalogue? And luckily it came up with no, this isn't a newspaper full of meetings data. I can't find this pattern. So it's, again, very rough and ready, and we need to spend more time refining it. But that hopefully will help on the information science level in terms of trying to catalogue basically what's in the newspapers, which again is something that has been done on a basic level by looking at the headlines at the top of the columns. But hopefully if someone was looking for this type of data, this kind of code would help them classify that within the much longer image files and text. So that's what the machine learning looks like. Again, it's very rough and ready and not really finished, so apologies for that. You can go on the GitHub page for the British Library Labs, and it's under Meetings Parser, all the code's there. But again, it's not very tidy, so I make my apologies that it's quite messy, because again, it's just all experimental. So there's still some issues. There's the Omeka platform's a bit clunky. It doesn't do everything. We had to mess around with some of the plugins. The main issue I've got with it is you can't download your search queries into a spreadsheet or any sort of CSV file. And I've looked for the help for that, and it seems like they're not developing that as a feature. So if you wanted to search for all the meetings in St Pancras and then download them, you can't do that at the moment, I'm afraid. And the Python code, as I said, needs refining. It's not perfect yet. And we're still working with chunks of Python code rather than the full text. So I've still got one chunk for geo-parsing everything and one chunk for dating everything. So there's still more to do. We still need to refine the NLP. I'd like to connect the forthcoming meetings columns with the reports of those meetings in the next issue. I just haven't got around to doing that. I think that'll be fairly simple to do. And more machine learning, particularly in terms of helping the British Library to identify what's in their newspaper collections. I'm also doing fun things with space syntax. So this is with University College London Bartlett School of Architecture have a space syntax lab, and we're currently, I'm sorry I've not got anything to show yet because we're still doing it, but we're building up a space syntax project where we're doing a syntactical map of Manchester in the 1840s, and we're going to plot all the meeting data on that. So on the screen is some projects to do the syntactical map of London. So space syntax is basically a way of classifying streets according to how well connected they are. So the red, you can see there that Regent Street is quite red, and Oxford Street and Euston Road is quite well connected because they connect very well with other streets. So it's basically just colour coding the streets to see how well they connect with each other, and then you can do some more complex statistical analysis of distances and things like that. So we're building up a historic syntactical map of Manchester and seeing, are there any patterns that we can find comparing the concentration of meetings in some areas with how well the streets are connected and integrated with each other, or are, say, more radical political meetings likely to happen in areas that aren't connected because they want to hide. So I'm afraid I can't show you any results yet because we're still working on the maps, but those are the hypotheses we're working from at the moment, and I think that's quite exciting. Certainly it's for me because I'm interested in the mapping side of things. I've also been liaising with Gideon Cohen up in Durham, who's encouraged me to do more statistical analysis of the data that's come out of the project, but he said that involves learning R, and that's terrifying. So I might leave him to sort of work that out. But he's said there's a lot more that can be done with the statistics of, say, frequency of meetings and probability that meetings occur in certain places. So finally, just to wrap up, what lessons have I learned? That it is possible to digitise an academic historian. It needs a lot of support, and I think as academic historians, we're normally used to working on our own, and actually a lot of this requires specialist skills that you need to work in a group with. And again, I know that Adam's been teaching undergraduates how to work in groups in a particular way that I think that normally as historians we don't normally work in, which is more of a everyone brings something different to the table and then you all work together to see how it all works. And that's been a learning process for me in terms of working out how that digital project works, in that you can't just do it all yourself, you have to rely on other people's expertise. And that information science and librarianship is a particular skill that, again, you need experts to explain to you and work out and see, particularly if you're using another institution's archives that are archived in a particular way and classified in a particular way. Credits, I've got lots of credits to sort of people to thank, but it's certainly a sort of group effort. And finally, if you want to look at more of my work, I've got a book to plug, as you said, but there's also all my maps, and my data is also my other website, which is protesthistory.org.uk, which is a lot more basic, but has a lot more sort of experimental map layering and that kind of thing on there. So hopefully eventually I'll be able to merge the two sort of data resources together into something a bit more usable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm certain that will have caught the fancy of everyone and also probably brought some questions to mind. So I'll pass over, first of all, to within the room, and then there may very well be some online questions as well. Questions, please.
I'll start. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I was wondering if, what was the question? If you could, would your data let you ask questions like, is there a relationship between someone doing the tour and then meetings? And like, could you say, even just to say, like, this happened before, and then that happened without necessarily knowing the causality of that?
Yeah, I think it will be the next process, which will be linking meetings, forthcoming meetings, to reports of the meetings. I think it would come in that stage, and I think that would be quite a simple thing to work out. I think was the meeting and the lecture tour announced in this paper, and then was there a great frequency of meetings afterwards? So again, it would involve a bit more quantification of frequencies of meetings and that sort of thing. I mean, at the moment, I've only got 4 years worth of data, so I don't know if you could prove that once a lecture has gone to one particular place, suddenly the movement takes off. Maybe you can actually. I think you'd have to choose places that we know lecturers were desperately trying to proselytise. So there were some areas, particularly rural areas, that had a lot of trouble forming branches because of the population. So they deliberately sent lecturers out to these places to try and drum up support for the movement. So I think you'd have to sort of choose the individual places and then see if you could test that theory. But yeah.
Any other questions? If not, I'll jump in while I can. Really interesting. I've got quite a few questions, but one of the ones I wanted to just probe you a little bit more, ask a little bit about more of your experiences, was with regard to the team side and with working with much more technically adept people, if you put it like that, or experts, if you will, either from libraries or information and things like that. And what I wanted to know was, how did you do it? How did you find them? And did you have to sort of bribe them in, or were they actually really interested in working with you? Because one of the experiences I found, actually, there's a lot of information scientists in particular who want to get their hands on what they might see as real data in that regard. And there is a hook for them in that sense. It isn't just a one-way street in that. Yeah. So could you maybe talk, because you mentioned I found the need to go in, and it was important to do teamwork. But how did you actually find that process working with them? And were they as excited about doing it as you were?
Well, the British Library and Labs competition has almost kind of set that system up for you, so that it was actually quite easy, obviously, to find the people because they've got their specialist team there in the digital scholarship department. Well, if they're interested in what I was trying to do, yes, they were. I think they're more interested in the information science element because, Mia knows this, from a librarian's point of view, what they wanted out of the project was, can we organise our data better? And can we find the data in this massive system that we're not catalogued sufficiently well? So I was helping them in some respects on that side of things. What I was trying to get out of the project again was, can I make my job easier by automating some of the processes that I do manually? And the research questions that were coming out of it were, can I find patterns, in geographical patterns in this data, historical data? And I think the general sort of, the data is quite interesting because I think it connects with people. So the technicians and the people at the British Library are quite interested just because a lot of the stuff's on their doorstep. A lot of the meetings happened, there's one meeting that happened on the site of the British Library in a pub that used to be there. So I think that connected, the historical side of that connected with them because of, you can see the actual places where these meetings were happening. So there was different aims and different objectives to what we were all doing, but I think they all worked together because we were sort of doing the same project. For the UCL stuff, that's a bit different in that I ended up,
Barrett School.
Yeah, the Barrett School Space Syntax. I'm working there with someone who used to be a historian and then has moved into that field, has kind of changed career. It's interesting there because they don't, all of them don't really know what historical data is. So they assume that it's all quite neat and tidy, and you've actually got to tell them it's very incomplete. There's lots of subjective things we don't know about this material. And for them, that's quite fascinating because they're used to quite neat and tidy data that, say, they've got from the Ordnance Survey today that's all checked and accurate. So we have to work around the fact that some of the data isn't there just simply because we don't have the historical records. So for them, I think it's been a bit of an eye-opener because as modern geographers, not all of them are used to working with that kind of historical data before.
And they didn't put them off?
No.
Excellent. Tessa?
Can I ask you, so obviously you have a background in this and you have historical knowledge about the whole chartist movement and so on. So doing this, all of this, mapping all these places out and so on, what did you find surprises in the data? Did you find like, oh, I had expected many more meetings taking place there, or something confounding your expectations, or did it largely confirm it, or did it draw your attention to, I don't know, geographical regions which you hadn't considered before? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so I normally work on the north of England because that's where I'm from. So my knowledge is mainly about Manchester, Leeds, those areas. I haven't looked at London at all. And actually, London Chartism has not really been studied that recently. I mean, there was some work in the 1960s, 1970s on it, but more recently, it's kind of looked over. So I didn't know anything about London Chartism at all. But because of all these London meetings that came up and the fact that I was based in London to do this, and we wanted to do some sort of public event where we could go and see some of the venues, that led me to look a lot more at London Chartism. And I think I've learned quite a lot about that. The fact that once you plot them out, you can see that there's distinct trade areas where branches of the movement were set up by individual trades. So the area in Soho that we did the walk through is mainly the tailors. So the tailors had several branches of the movement, and we plotted where they met, and a lot of the pubs still existed. And that was another surprise, again, because I don't really know much about the physical history of London, is that so many of the places that we found in the data still exist today. The buildings are still there. Some of them are the same name, same pubs. So for a historical point of view, that's what I got out of it, is that I learned a lot more about London Chartism. And I didn't expect there to be so much about London Chartism in the Northern Star, because it was a northern newspaper based in Leeds. So hopefully that's useful to historians as well.
Can I ask James Baker's question? He's posted online.
Okay.
Kind of follows on from that. He says he's interested in how you see this fitting in with your research. So are you looking for data / graphs / patterns that you can cite, or that push you towards researching something that you hadn't thought of? Or would it be okay, or would you be okay with finding nothing from all this effort? I guess in terms of from a historian's perspective, nothing you can put in your book or whatever.
I think I'm a lot more confident now that I can generalize about things, because we've got 5,000 meetings in a way that previously, if you can physically probably do about 200, and then you give up, so you're a bit bored. Whereas now I think I'm a lot more confident saying, well, I've got enough data here to generalize. I mean, it's not big data, but it's enough to say generally I think that meetings occur in these places, at least the ones that are advertised. The other thing that this has really helped me with also is getting enough data for the space syntax project, which I'm a lot more excited about at the moment, which is, can I map all these meetings now onto layers of in a way that you can explain a bit more accurately and using more statistical evidence than usually as a standard academic historian. You're a lot more descriptive, and you're reliant on personal descriptions and sources like diaries and prose-based personal records. Whereas I think here now I'm a lot more confident in trying to generalise using statistics in a way that I don't think I would have been if I hadn't have done this project.
The thing you created is very exploratory for a user, right? So I can go to your website and I can play with it, and I can find things that are interesting to me. But tying into this notion of how do you put that on paper? How does your interactivity get into the ref?
Right. Well, that's a big question.
But an important one.
Yeah. Again, it's I can now sort of come up with tables of okay, there's or graphs or pie charts or whatever of I know that 80% of these meetings happen in pubs. That's quite important in terms of working out the locations of working class meeting spaces. I can come up with more statistical evidence from this than I think I couldn't have done with smaller amount of data. So I'll build up a lot more evidence base that I could use in my research.
Yes, please.
You're obviously quite familiar with the newspapers. Do you think you lost any of the value in the process? Like if you were to look at the actual physical image versus the data you've extracted from it, do you think there's anything that's been lost from a historical perspective in that process?
Normally, I'd like to say yes, but I don't think with this data. I think because it's so formulaic, it basically just says, London St Pancras. There's a meeting on Tuesday in the Dog and Bull or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think there's not much more you can get from the paper copy or a microfilm copy than you can with the text. So it's not like you're looking at images, say, from a newspaper or where you really would benefit from looking at the original or a decent copy of them. I think with this kind of textual information, I think it's actually made it a lot easier. And again, when I started my research, the Northern Star and most of the newspapers weren't digitised, so I started doing all this when they were still on microfilm and having to scroll through sort of dirty microfilms in a provincial library. So for me, it's been a big leap, whereas I think for you, hopefully, you're going straight into this, so it's a lot easier for you to then, you can just keyword search for things. It does make you very aware of the fact that the newspapers that you can access through various subscription sites aren't very well OCR'd. So that's why, so when you're searching for things, then obviously you'll get lots of false positives and lots of negatives for things that should be there. So I think it's shown the British Library that they need to rethink their OCR, because they're reliant on quite old copies of OCR that is very inaccurate. So when you're doing your keyword searching, I think people then get a bit complacent about keyword searching and think, oh, I found everything. And then they found actually only half of the instances of whatever they're looking for. So certainly the key step for me in doing this was re-OCRing everything, because then I knew at least it was accurate what I was going and putting through the system.
Any other questions?
Does that undermine, sorry, I'll let you go, Luke. Does that undermine all the previous research that's been done? Because like, you're kind of suggesting, well, I mean, now I've got all of it. So all that stuff they did before must have been crap, because like, how does that change what we think of this stuff that was supposedly done very carefully by these very studious people who sat in the library for years and years and years? Is this better?
No, it's just bigger, I guess.
Is more data mean better research? Or?
No, because then you've got the whole debate about close reading and whether you should, I mean, I'm not doing any sort of distant reading here, actually. I'm just looking at,
your map was when you had your heat map. That's you said, so look here, you can see Soho is the interesting bit. You did that from afar, didn't you?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call that distant reading, though, really.
So what would it be?
Yeah.
Extracting data?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that, previous, I'm not discounting the whole of previous research, because also, it's presuming that people weren't aware of the fact that a lot of this stuff's inaccurate, and of course they were, and they make accountancies for that. And this isn't a foolproof system either, so I think it's just a different way of doing it, and that I'm a bit more confident with the data, because I know I've seen the OCR for it.
Great talk, thank you very much. I was just wondering, you just suggested re-OCRing because technology progresses, and if everything was re-OCR'd now, it would probably deliver much better quality. I'm just wondering, because you also had the crowdsourcing in your in the title of your talk. I know the British Newspaper Archive is also employing crowdsourcing. I'm just wondering how that goes together with I for one would feel quite annoyed if I had kind of transcribed something and then it was just re-OCR'd the other year, the year after, basically.
Yeah.
So I haven't crowdsourced anything. I haven't contributed to the transcription. I'm just thinking about general strategies. I'm just wondering what your views are.
Yeah, I think with crowdsourcing, you have to double key everything. So you have to have at least two people doing the same thing, because naturally people make mistakes. So you have to have a double check, and that's really labour intensive. Now, and I'm not saying that OCR is the answer, because I knew that what I was putting into the OCR was fairly regular and quite easy to read. I suspect that if you put a different newspaper in it, it would have a lot worse accuracy. So I don't think we've reached the stage where the OCR is 100% brilliant for everything. But for my particular project, I found that saved a lot of time.
Another comment, just a comment on the limitations of Omeka. You can just do the queries like on the underlying MySQL database.
Okay.
You don't necessarily have to go through the Omeka.
Yeah, but this was for the public user. The public can't.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
Which the point about the website is that it's public facing, so people be able to search for their hometown and then download the data, but they can't download it, which is a bit annoying. They can only just see it on the screen.
And then cut and paste it.
Not easily, because it all comes up with all the individual images as well. So, but then I have looked into the help for Omeka, and they said that facility is not available at the moment.
I have to confess, I haven't read your book.
That's
I have
all right.
read the introduction. And the introduction is quite theoretical. And you haven't actually mentioned theory at all tonight. How much did the work of people like Doreen Massey influence the way you started off and looked at this, and how much did what you found make you look again at the theory?
I've separated this project out from my other research, really, in terms of the theoretical material, because what I gained from Massey is, I mean, I'm a bit bored of all the third space and Lefebvre and Sawyer and all that. I think it just complicates things. Whereas I like Massey's approach, because she's talking about space as a kind of medium in which people are included and excluded, and I quite like that as a kind of way of thinking about particularly popular protest. That you're either included in something or excluded, or the government's trying to include people or exclude people. The economy includes people or excludes people. So that influences my own sort of academic research, but I haven't connected the two with the digital side at all, really. I mean, maybe I should do, as your pointer, to make me think about what this data tells me about, say, Massey's theories about dispossession. But in terms of the third space and what this tells us about, relative space and spaces of materiality and all that, I'm not too sure, really. I mean, in some ways, the digital space is a different space in itself, which I know other theorists have thought about, but I'm hopefully just sticking to ground level by mapping them onto historic maps rather than thinking about where it fits in terms of theory.
Any other questions? Perhaps one last one from myself then, if I may. If you were going to do that again, Katrina, the whole project,
Yeah.
what would you do differently, if anything?
That's a major question, isn't it?
I don't know, maybe.
Yeah. I think I would have had a better plan at the start, because I think we tried lots and lots of things, and because of the time limitations, a lot of the experiments ended up in cul-de-sacs. So I think we would have said, okay, we'll do this amount of work on this, and if it doesn't work, we'll move on to the next. I think that's what I learned about the group work side of things, is that you really need a strict plan of who's doing what and when, because as academics, we're very used to working individually in our own time frame, and I think that way of project-based working isn't something I'm used to. So I think I would have thought a lot more perhaps about how it actually works as a project-based rather than as an individual sort of academic thing.
Are there any spaces you can share those cul-de-sacs? Because why should I suffer from your same cul-de-sac? Like, how do you share that knowledge?
I mean, I've talked through some of it today, some of the things that we came across, particularly in terms of the mapping, in terms of the fact that, well, the two main cul-de-sacs were that we couldn't find the images, and some of the images we haven't found. So some of them are institutional, so I'm not sure whether the BL would want all the institutional cul-de-sacs to be advertised, but the other things like just basic things like server space is not available for all the mapping is another question. So hopefully talks like this advertise some of the problems and the fact that there are problems and you just have to work out solutions to how you get around them.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I think we should just certainly thank Katrina again for an excellent and very, very stimulating talk. I should say before I let you go 2 things. One, we are back again for our next seminar, which is a joint seminar on the unnormal date for us of a Friday, I believe it is, 19th of February at 5:15, wherein we're co-hosting with the Public History Seminar, Pride of Place of England's LGBT Heritage with Rosie Sharrington, Alison Oram, Justin Benning, I think it is. Can't read my own handwriting, which is actually in the advertised room, which was SH246, the south on the south block. So not in this room. Hope to see you all there. And finally, last thing, please join us in the College Arms just down on Store Street here for a drink, or indeed if you want to grab a bite with us there as well. So thank you once again, Katrina.